Welcome to the story of arguably the most powerful pivot of American history. There have been a lot of them. But emancipation is a candidate. There's so many ways of demonstrating the significance of the emancipation of 4 million slaves in the midst of all-out and increasingly totalizing war. Here's one. In one elderly former slave's memory, some of you are surely familiar with the famous Works Project Administration narrative histories, that is, interviews, oral histories with former slaves. They did over 3,000 of them, beginning in the 1920s, but especially in the 30s. In 1937, a former slave named Cornelius Garner was interviewed at the age of 91, asked if he had fought in the Civil War. Garner replied to his black interviewer, "Did I fight in the war? Well, if I hadn't, you wouldn't be sitting there writing today." Bit cantankerous, maybe. He described the corner in his native Norfolk, Virginia, where slave auctions used to be conducted on New Year's Day. That day, he said, New Year's Day, should be kept by all the colored people. That is the day of freedom, and they ought to remember Frederick Douglass too. Frederick Douglass told Abe Lincoln, "Give the black man guns and let him fight." Abe Lincoln say, "If I give him a gun, when he come to battle, he might run." Frederick Douglass say, "Try him, and you'll win the war." Abe said, "All right, I'll try." Hey, almost anybody can write history. I mean, that's not entirely inaccurate, Cornelius's wonderful memory. In your Yale and Slavery book, I urge you to look to our interlude, which is, I should back up, I suppose, on the Wesley family. It's called A Yale Family in Slavery and Freedom. It begins on page 242. We did these, as you know, we did these interludes on distinct subjects. During the Civil War, in fact, in 1862, the year we'll focus here mostly on today, a couple named Alfred and Eliza Manning boarded a steamship off the coast of North Carolina with their very young son, whose name was John. They found an empty steamer drum, drilled holes in it, and placed their child John inside. Like the mother of Moses, hiding her baby in a basket of bulrushes, they covered their own boy with clothes and told him to be quiet. The vessel belonged to the Union Navy, part of a northern blockade intended to prevent the Confederacy from transporting and profiting from plantation goods. Now, by 62, the blockade was not by any means airtight. Alfred and Eliza said goodbye to John, their son, and asked the Union sailors to take him to safety. Maybe you've read Sophie's Choice about the Holocaust. Maybe you've read, who knows what you've read. The ship was bound for New Haven, Connecticut. And the Mannings, along with other family members, eventually joined the little boy there later. Exactly how John survived at first, we don't entirely know. What we do know is that many years later, in 1881, John Wessling Manning graduated from Yale College. And when his own wife gave birth to their first child, they christened her Yale. You know, when you find those things in archives, stories like that, you know, are manna from heaven. And then it's a matter of what you do with those stories. Emancipation was in some ways not just days of jubilee, not just days of song and poetry. It was a bloody, horrible process. I'll get to the process more on Thursday. This week is Emancipation Week, not Infrastructure Week. How did it all happen? It was a process of policy, and it was a process of process. I will argue here today and Thursday that it took both. We've long had a debate, sometimes I think a false debate, or a dead-end debate about who freed the slaves. Was it Lincoln and his administration and the Army and Navy, or was it the slaves themselves with their own volition, their own bravery, their own feat? The answer is both. And to understand history, fortunately, I think, the answer is often both. But who was this fellow, Lincoln? There's so many versions of Abraham Lincoln in American historical lore and American memory. Depends on which decade, which era, which period you look. I got in trouble once in my first year teaching at Harvard. I only taught there 2 years. Junior faculty member, I had to get out. But I was teaching the intro, kind of survey of African American history, and I gave my Lincoln and policy lecture before I gave my on-the-ground process lecture. And this was the late 1980s. It was a very different moment. And a delegation of African American students at Harvard visited my office to tell me they didn't like Abraham Lincoln being portrayed as an emancipator. And I said, oh? Is that what you think I just did? Yes. He's not the great emancipator. I said, okay, I know. There are other, we had a very interesting discussion, finally. And thank God I had one more lecture to give on the subject. I don't know that I earned them back or won them back, but some of them were not prepared to accept anything about Lincoln's role in this. Yes, he was a white supremacist. You can see it in some expressions in the Lincoln-Douglas debates. He's an old Henry Clay Whig. He's a gradualist, no question. We'll talk about that in a minute. But he had a certain capacity to grow. And sometimes in American political history, American politics, we like our presidents, our candidates, our leaders kind of pure. We never had one who was pure. It's a weird word to use right now, isn't it? Given that we're a week away from a rather impure election. But the way Lincoln has been remembered is absolutely fascinating for what it says about us and what it says about the country. Far less about him. He was at the center of this story. And this story means a lot to people. About maybe 25 years ago now, the National Archives in Washington, maybe it's 30 years now, it was in the 90s, put on display for the first time in years and years and years, an actual original version, there are about 3 or 4 of them, in Lincoln's own hand of the Emancipation Proclamation in the Great Hall of the National Archives. Some of you have been there. They display the great documents of the country and so on. The line to see it went out the door and down the street for blocks. African Americans, often in the majority, who just wanted to see it. They probably were expressing, without ever saying it, that, you know, okay, Lincoln, it wasn't all Lincoln's doing. Lincoln didn't free the slaves. Slaves freed themselves. It was a process. It was the government. It was the army. It was people themselves. It was war. Sure. But they might have been saying something like, okay, but if Lincoln didn't free the slaves, then the United States didn't. And if the United States didn't, and freedom doesn't mean anything. I brought a copy, that's a facsimile. I didn't steal anything from the National Archives here. I brought a facsimile for those of you who are weird enough to want to come up and look at it. I challenge you to be weird enough. Of the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln's own hand. He wrote the thing on paper. The actual words. I think it's Richard Hofstadter who once said the Emancipation Proclamation has all the eloquence of a bill of lading, which means a grocery list, milk, bread. It is a very legalistic document. You start reading and you think, all right, enough herewith and whereas and therefores, enough already. I'm not in a courtroom. Yes, you are. It's the courtroom of history. And Lincoln knew he was writing a very legal document. This baby is an executive order by the president. It's not an act of Congress. He's not signing any act of Congress here. There's been no referendum. There's a very bloody war going on, and the Battle of Antietam made it now at least possible, we'll come back to that in a second, to do this. And he's taking extraordinary liberties with executive power. He's about to start. It doesn't free all the slaves by any means, as you probably know, at first. But he's beginning to free, to liberate, to eliminate the largest source of property ever in American history. There's never been. Imagine today, the federal government decides to liquidate the property of Silicon Valley. I mean, they're not going to do that, are they? Never say never. I mean, I can't imagine it, but, or, you know, Harry Truman once federalized the steel companies. Or what did the United States do in World War II? They didn't take over everything, but sort of did. Converted all those incredible auto and truck factories in Michigan, where I was, well, born later, into production of tanks and jeeps and all kinds of weaponry for airplanes. I grew up about 120 yards from the Anderson tank plant in Flint, Michigan, right across the C&O railroad tracks and some fences. That's where they made the Anderson tanks. As far as the eye could see. When I was really little, there were tanks there. By the end of the 50s, they converted it to building, fallout shelters. And they weren't selling. And the whole gigantic lot was full of these cans with a spout. These weren't selling. People weren't digging them in their backyard to meet the production. Anyway, that executive order went beyond presidential power by a lot of people's estimation, but this was a war. Many people have tried to describe Lincoln. Here are four of my favorites. H.L. Mencken, the great satirist, I mean, a cantankerous SOB if ever there was one in the history of American journalism. He blistered everybody in the 1920s, 30s, 40s. But he said of Lincoln, Lincoln becomes the American solar myth, the chief butt of American credulity and sentimentality, rendered a mere moral apparition, a sort of amalgam of John Wesley and the Holy Ghost, fit for adoration at the Chautauquas and the YMCAs. This is Mencken's way of saying, I mean, make your Lincoln, whatever you want. Just whichever one. Pick, here are 12 varieties, pick one. Carl Sandburg, the great Illinois poet, narrative historian, wrote the multi-volume Poet's Biography of Lincoln. Sandburg's Lincoln? A man of both steel and velvet. Woo, paradox. Who is as hard as rock and as soft as drifting fog. Who holds in his heart and mind the paradox of terrible storm and peace unspeakable. Lincoln could do it all. He could make war, he could make peace, and he knew just the right time to do it. Sort of. Ida Tarbell, the great muckraker in the Progressive era, she blistered people too. But whoa, what a writer. She said, Lincoln, he never hi-hats you and he never bores you. I keep him on my workbench because he is so companionable. He's a companion to read when you need. You need a little Lincoln? Look him up. And then W.B. Du Bois, the greatest black scholar of the 20th century, who weighed in on this very, very diligently. At a time, it was actually 1922 in the Crisis magazine, he was sick and tired of all the lauding of Robert E. Lee that was going on out in that American reconciliation. Enough already. He said he was basically sick to death of hearing all this blather about Lee. So he said, hey, let's not forget Lincoln. And Du Bois said, I love him. Not because he was perfect, but because he was not, and yet triumphed. It's probably my favorite quote about Lincoln ever. He goes on, he said, Lincoln was big enough to be inconsistent, cruel, merciful, peace-loving, a fighter, despising Negroes and letting them fight and vote, protecting slavery and freeing slaves. He was a man, a big, inconsistent, brave man. Inconsistent. Is it Emerson who said, inconsistency is the hobgoblin of simple minds? Start accusing somebody of being inconsistent, be careful, you might be accusing them of being human. And even Booker T. Washington, the great black leader of the early 20th century, said, Lincoln unfettered himself. He climbed up out of the valley where his vision was narrowed and weakened by the fog and the miasma onto a mountaintop. Pick your Lincoln. Yeah, a whole lot to pick from. There are more books written on the American Civil War, of course, than any other subject in human history, except the Bible. And there are more books written on Lincoln within that genre than any other subject. It got to be ridiculous during the Lincoln bicentennial in 2009, because there were so many Lincoln books, you couldn't read them if you tried. I tried to read quite a few of them. I wrote a review essay. My dear friend Eric Foner had the best idea, though. He got himself onto the Abraham Lincoln Book Prize Committee for the next year. So he could read all these books coming out on Lincoln while he was writing his, called Tried by Fire, on Lincoln and Slavery. It's one of the best books ever written on Lincoln, and it won the Pulitzer Prize. The Pulitzer, by the way, is all timing. There's nothing to do with talent. Okay, now, to my childhood hero as a historian, just for one brief quote. I hate to confess too many things at once, but when I was a kid, the first historian I remember reading, I read about Johnny Tremaine and all that stuff in grade school, and I don't know where we started reading anything serious. But I started reading Bruce Catton in my early teens. I don't even know who put the first Bruce Catton book in my hands. It wasn't my parents. And then I used to pray for rain in my summer job because I could just have time off to go read Bruce. Catton grew up in Michigan. He wrote 18 books about the Civil War period. He was the greatest narrative historian the Civil War ever had. He was a popular historian, which is why most academics never really liked him. He sold too many books, and you could write like an angel. He wrote like a dream. Catton wrote the best topic sentences I've ever read. They just make you read on. That's what a topic sentence is. It's not what they taught you in the 8th grade. It's a topic sentence, explains what the paragraph is. No, it's a sentence that grabs you by the throat and makes you read on. Here is Bruce Catton's description in his book called Terrible Swift Sword, which is on 1862. Oh, and was he a clever marketer? He would write a book on 1862, a book on 1863, a book on 1864, and you kind of back up and do another one. Boy, man, he was a one-man marketing machine. But here was his description of this moment in the Civil War. When Lee's army is about to invade the North up through Maryland, destined for this bloodiest day of the Civil War at Antietam, and what will lead to emancipation. And here's Catton's description. There was nobility in the idea that there ought to be a peace without victory. You can't stop there. No. Yet in August of 1862, America's tragedy was that it was caught between the madness of going on with the war and the human impossibility of stopping it. That's a definition of tragedy. Secession had been a direct result of the outcome of the election of 1860. To restore the status quo would be to assume that either the North or the South had had a great change of heart, that the North would not again go Republican, or that the South would quietly acquiesce if it did. Neither Mr. Lincoln nor Mr. Davis, Jefferson Davis, was going to assume anything of the kind. Each man was fighting for a dreadful simplicity. Neither one could describe a solution acceptable to him without describing something wholly unacceptable to the other. Neither man could accept anything less than complete victory without admitting complete defeat. Both sides had heard the trumpet that could never call retreat. The peacemakers could not be heard until the terrible swift sword had been sheathed. But the scabbard had been thrown away, and now the Confederacy was carrying the war into the enemy's country. Now think of the audacity in that simple paragraph. Anybody with the chutzpah to quote the Battle Hymn of the Republic twice in one paragraph is either crazy or a genius. Catton had a horrible drinking problem, so he probably was both. Lincoln can be extraordinarily ambiguous, enigmatic, and that's why I love this painting. You got to back up from it a little with your eyes. He's in there, but what Lincoln is it? Well, you can't quite entirely see him. He's hard to focus on. Trying to get Lincoln in focus has been the story of Lincoln. Which Lincoln? The man of puzzling dualism, who's anti-slavery but not entirely so. You know, that storytelling, rail splitter, joke-talking frontier lawyer type who loved a dirty joke at a saloon, even though he didn't drink. Lincoln should have. Or do you like the towering political genius who so many people have tried to say, Lincoln always had the right timing? No, he didn't. He's human. And he really screwed up with his running mate choice in 1864, but we'll get to him. Do you like that towering genius? Do you like that moral leader, the shaper of the nation's destiny, the savior of the Union, and the great emancipator? What does it say on the Lincoln Memorial? I'm not going to tell you. You can look it up. Within 30 seconds, somebody's going to shout it out at me. I know. I can still remember the day when the first time some student looked up something I had just said and told me about it on their phone, but that's a long time ago. He was brilliant at metaphors. And you know that if you started reading the speeches or the great state letters, state papers that he wrote, from the House Divided to many, many others, to the better angels of our nature, to so many others. In fact, Jim McPherson once wrote an essay called How Lincoln Won the War with Metaphors. Now, I don't know about that. I think the Union Army had something to say about that as well. Was he the person who held back emancipation as a white supremacist? Was he the person who held back emancipation because he was a gradualist? Yes. Did he hold back emancipation for a while because he didn't want to have a revolution? And he didn't know where this revolution was going to go? Or is he the person who sort of outgrew his own prejudices to enough degree, to a significant degree, to indeed find a method of winning the Civil War by freeing 4 million people? He sure as hell was a shrewd politician. He could be wise, and he could be desperately sometimes confused. We like our Lincoln pure. He ain't. Sorry. You can leave now if you want, but he just isn't. Emancipation itself, as he virtually acknowledged, came out of the logic of events. In fact, he did say that. It came from the logic of events. He said, events are in the saddle and they rule mankind. I'm not doing this. Events were more powerful than his own personal volition. And how many times do we find that in history? How much did FDR really control during his nearly 4 terms, running the United States in the Depression and World War II? But the timing, I should say, and the manner of the coming of emancipation was largely Lincoln's. Now, I'm going to back up a little now to, love that drawing paint. It's so weird and crazy. Oh, by the way, you know, a lot of you probably saw Spielberg's movie Lincoln, did you? How many of you saw Spielberg's Lincoln? Yeah, we'll talk about myth-making. There he is. 13th Amendment. That's a lot of good history in that film, and some good movie making, especially that opening scene that has Lincoln sitting in a camp in a rainstorm. He's kind of under a tent. He's up on some kind of platform, and 2 black soldiers come up to him, and they have this conversation with Lincoln. It's an amazing scene. It never happened. But no one cares, right? Except a bunch of fussy historians. I was among 10 historians who gathered at a swanky midtown hotel in New York when Spielberg had just committed to Tony Kushner as his screenwriter and dumped another guy who had written the first screenplay. And they had Doris Kearns Goodwin and Jim McPherson put 10 historians in a room who all knew something about Lincoln or emancipation or something. And we spent an entire day debating how that film ought to go. An unforgettable experience. Spielberg ran the seminar. He did, all day long, with all these headstrong historians just popping off everything and showing off for each other. I was kind of one of the younger whippersnappers in the group. I'll never forget it because later when the film came out, I thought, a lot of good we did. Because at that point he was still planning to make the entire war in one giant epic with Lincoln at the center. And he, I guess, discovered, no, can't do that. So they focused on 3 months and the making of the 13th Amendment. It has 3 or 4 endings, too. I think they filmed 3 or 4 endings and decided, let's use them all. I never understood that, but it's Spielberg's Lincoln. Tony Kushner's Lincoln. There have been a lot of Lincolns. Back up with me, it's just one of the cartoons that came out during the Lincoln film phenomenon. Now remember this map, I showed it to you. Big picture, naval blockade, invade the South through Virginia, going to happen over and over and over in this war, invade the South through Kentucky and Tennessee, that's going to happen over and over. It will result first in the river war along the Tennessee River, Cumberland Rivers, the capture of Fort Donelson, the capture of Fort Henry, and then the terribly bloody battle down at Shiloh in southwestern Tennessee, a place called Pittsburgh Landing, that should be lower on the map. And then the other idea was to split the South in half by taking the Mississippi River, and they were doing pretty well at this in 1862 at first, because Admiral Farragut took New Orleans in April 1862, the same time Shiloh was happening on the land. Farragut captured New Orleans with a fleet, the mouth of the Mississippi River. An amazing naval feat. He'll have another amazing naval feat 2 years later at Mobile Bay in the biggest naval engagement of the entire war. But this was the sort of grand strategy. Oh, there's Charlie again. Remember Charlie Brewster? He's my man from Massachusetts whose letters I edited and published. I think I told you about Charlie getting his sash and his sword when he became an officer. It was like wedding day for him. He's going to see serious, horrible combat during the Peninsula Campaign. Right down here. At the Battle of Five Forks, on the way toward Richmond, and the Battle of the 7 Days, he writes these amazing letters to his mother. Long letters about how gorgeous the army looks in the distance while it's marching in the morning with the sun gleaming off bayonets. The kid could write. Well, he's 28 by then. But at Five Forks, he goes silent. This was the first major engagement between McClellan and the Confederate armies. It happens about halfway up the peninsula. Sorry, it's not labeled on here. And he was writing almost every day. And he goes silent for about 4 or 5 days, and then and imagine being his mother. But he opens the next letter. It's 3 or 4 days after Five Forks, and he says, well, I suspect, Mother, you've been wondering. I am alive, but I don't know why. Men on both sides of me were shot. For the first time, I've heard bullets entering bodies. I've seen my comrades bleed to death in front of me. We were under attack constantly. We had to retreat. He keeps repeating, I don't know why I'm alive. Then he describes field hospitals with piles of arms and legs after amputations. And then he does what Charlie always tended to do. He sort of lifts his mother up at the end and says, but we're moving on. I'm told we're going to Richmond. Pretty soon he writes a letter saying we can see the church steeples of Richmond. And he will experience the whole Battle of the 7 Days and survive that too. Often he's in defensive positions, but his 10th Massachusetts Regiment took a lot of casualties, and it's during the Peninsula Campaign that they made him adjutant, and he had to start writing home about the list of dead men. Often, they all knew each other's families. He would sometimes write these to the local newspapers, sometimes just to his mother and sister and say, can you send this over to the Northampton, whatever it was called. Now, Lee will decide in the wake of the 7 days, and by the way, the 7 days battles were the first time in this war that armies faced each other day in, day out for 7 days, with some movement, sometimes not movement, and constant engagement of infantry and artillery, massive casualties. It was in the Peninsula Campaign, though, where the country, if it chose to understand it, got a full understanding of George McClellan, who did not like taking the offensive. McClellan's training and his mentality, in his case, said, do not go on the offensive. Now, he wasn't always wrong about that, but he was wrong here. He's just put his entire army of almost 100,000 people on this peninsula to march at 60 miles toward Richmond. The whole idea was to threaten Richmond from the east, because they might not be fortified along the east, they would be fortified along the north and maybe the west, because the assumption was always the Union armies would invade through the western part of Virginia down through the Shenandoah. And McClellan said, no, find every ship you can and we'll float our army, as though that was going to be a surprise. Hundreds of ships floating a gigantic army down the Chesapeake was not a surprise. And then he spent a month, April 5 to May 4, putting Yorktown under siege. There was no siege to make. He believed the Confederate army there was much, much larger than it actually was, for various reasons. He just sat there for a month, enabling the Confederates to really constantly build fortifications along the eastern edge of Richmond, which is where they will fight the 7 days. At the end of the 7 days, McClellan's army, in mostly virtual defeat, is held up along the southern banks of the James River. The final battle of that 7 days is known as the Battle of Malvern Hill, a horribly bloody thing. Offensive assaults by the Confederates, now under the command of a guy named Robert E. Lee. Lee gets command of this Confederate army because the Confederate commander, Joseph Johnston, was badly wounded in the 7 days, just before the 7 days. And Jefferson Davis said, well, Lee, you're in command. And Lee will be in command of that army of, well, they called it the Army of Northern Virginia, which had a little chutzpah in it. They weren't always in Northern Virginia. Lee will command that army the rest of the war and become, for some people, the most famous soldier of this war, for some. But Lee now has to make a decision, and Jefferson Davis didn't necessarily want him to do this, but he did it. He decided Virginia was ravaged now by war. They'd been fighting in Virginia now for way over a year, well over a year. And his theory was, take the war out of Virginia, leave a small force in front of Richmond. But here again, McClellan and Lee knew each other. They knew each other from Mexico. They knew each other by reputation. Part of the story, only part of the story, is that Lee expected McClellan to do nothing, which is what McClellan, of course, did. Nothing, except complain over and over and over in letters and dispatches to the War Department and to Lincoln himself. He kept telling Lincoln, I don't have enough troops. I don't have enough spies. I don't have enough cavalry. I don't have enough artillery. I don't have enough of anything. You're not supplying me enough. This failure was your failure. And Lincoln, by this point, is saying, but where's Lincoln going to turn? He does not have another general he can trust. So Lee decides to invade Maryland. He doesn't know precisely where he's going, but he wanted to invade the North to take the war out of ravaged Virginia. He wanted to win a victory on Northern soil somewhere if he could. He's not going to make it to Pennsylvania on this trip. The following year, of course, he will, to Gettysburg. He wanted to threaten Northern cities, especially Washington, next Philadelphia, who knows after that? And, as important as anything else, there was a very real chance in the summer of 1862 of getting British recognition of the Confederacy. This is not yet a war to destroy slavery. It's beginning to destroy slavery, but in Britain, the most important player in this story internationally, although France and Russia were important here too. This is not yet a war for or against slavery, or so it seems. And the British came very close to formal recognition of the Confederacy because part of the British regime, I can't go into all of it right now, although a little later I will talk about Europe and the war, they wanted a divided America. It was in their interest. Still remember the War of 1812 and the American Revolution, and a divided America was in British interest. Now, the idea here too for Lee, and book after book after book has been written about this, about Robert E. Lee being an offensive soldier who did not know how to stay on the defensive, who just couldn't do it. He was aggressive. He wanted to attack. He wanted to take the war to the enemy. He thought, too. It's a very political war. Don't forget, I said this earlier. And Lee understands that. He may or may not have understood it quite as much as Grant eventually, but Lee understood this is a very political war. And he believes there's a great deal of secessionist, pro-Confederate spirit in Maryland and Western Virginia, and maybe even in southern Pennsylvania. He's going to overestimate that. But as he invaded the North into Maryland, his troops weren't well fed. They had good morale because they had just won at the 7 days with tremendous bloodshed. Confederates lost more soldiers at the 7 days than the Union did because the Union forces were always on the defensive. On September 5, Lee crossed the Potomac River into Maryland. He went up to Frederick, Maryland. You can see Frederick on the map, I think. Oh dear. Yeah, there it is. But then one of those weird things in war or any other kind of history happened. You may know this. Lee had his 3 corps, which is, armies were divided into corps, divisions within the corps, brigades within the division, regiments within the brigades, and so on. But the 3 corps, the 3 parts of Lee's army, were divided. They were, in some cases, 20 miles apart, moving slowly north, 15 miles apart or so. Lee sent an order wrapped around 3 cigars to his 3 corps commanders. The order was to concentrate at a certain place within 24 to 36 hours. Those orders never arrived. They were dropped by the courier along the side of a road, and a private in an Indiana regiment picked it up. His name was Private S.W. Mitchell. He picked up Special Order 191, the famous lost order, on the 13th of September, not too far from Frederick, Maryland. He didn't quite know what it was about, but he saw R.E. Lee had signed the 3 orders, and he knew who that was. So he immediately gave it to his colonel, who gave it to his brigade commander, who gave it to whoever was next, and within less than an hour, McClellan had this order. And McClellan's army is moving slowly to the west to try to get between Lee and Washington and between Lee and Philadelphia or whatever, however they could stop him. And at first, McClellan chose not to believe it. Thought it might be a ruse, planted. It didn't take too long before they realized, no, this is for real. They had other people look at Lee's signature, people who had seen Lee's writing. And suddenly, it was as though Lee had walked into his tent and said, here's where I'm sending my 3 corps, in the next 48 hours, and you do what you wish. McClellan took about 3 days to decide what to do next. He always did. And then finally, the 2 armies will connect first at Cedar Mountain, just to the east of Sharpsburg, up there. Oh, they don't have Cedar Mountain on here. Or do they? Nope, they don't. They do? Oh, no, I don't mean Cedar Mountain. I mean South Mountain. Sorry, it's not on here. Which is just east of Sharpsburg, where the Antietam Creek goes through. And then on the 17th of September, this is 4 days now after the order was found, McClellan moved his army as much as he could move. He had 90,000 men. Lee had about 60,000 able. By the way, the only food they actually had were green corn and a few other things, apples, and whatever food they could steal. They also were requisitioning occasional slaves in Maryland and sending them back into Virginia. They're going to do even more of that in the next year in the Gettysburg campaign. But they'll meet at Antietam Creek in cornfields, in half-dug trenches that were built for roads, across a bridge known as Burnside's Bridge, eventually named for the general. They will fight for 8 hours that day, and there were 23,000 casualties in 8 hours. That's about 1/5 of the population of New Haven killed or wounded in 1 day. Lethal weapons, hand-to-hand combat, close-in fighting. Had troops run into each other in cornfields. And this was September, so the corn stalks were really high. It was a horrific bloodletting. At the end of it, Lee's army backed away in terrible condition. I mean, there are dead and wounded all over this field, and if you ever go visit Antietam National Battlefield on the 17th of September, they do an extraordinary, anybody ever seen it, the event they do there? They put out a luminaria, the little lights in bags for each of the 23,000 all over the landscape at sunset. I only saw it once, but it's enough. McClellan stayed still, and Lee moved back away from Sharpsburg, back away from Antietam, back eventually across, the Potomac River. Lee's army, in the condition it was in, escaped from Maryland. Lincoln gets the news. It seems like a Union victory, finally, in the Eastern theater of the war, finally. But he's begging McClellan, move to the right or the left, use cavalry, try to surround Lee's army, defeat him right now, end the war. And had that happened, or had McClellan won on the peninsula, who knows, emancipation might not have followed. Lee will escape. His army, most of it, will escape back into Virginia, not only to fight again, but to fight again and again and again. And that brings us, meantime, I'm going to have to leave you here in a minute or two in the process, in the making of the policy. Back up with me from September 62, back into the spring of 62. Lincoln's going to issue an order of war, which begins a kind of process to some extent of, here, I can show you again. In March of 62, he authorized the acceptance of runaway slaves into the Union Army, which had been a huge dispute during that winter. And then on the 16th of April, the Congress, and Lincoln will sign it, abolished slavery in the District of Columbia. 3,100 slaves were freed overnight. That's how many were left in D.C. I'll say more about that next time. Then in June, Congress, think about all the disputes from, Missouri to Kansas, Nebraska to Dred Scott, all these disputes over slavery in the Western territories. With the Confederate States out of the Union, Congress voted to end slavery forever in all Western territories. Boom, just like that. And Lincoln gladly signed it. That was the identity of the Republican Party. And then on July 17th, they passed what was called the Second Confiscation Act. It had a longer title, but it's the Second Confiscation. The First Confiscation Act was passed in fall of 61, which allowed or authorized Union forces to confiscate enemy property, but not yet slaves. But in the Second Confiscation Act actually went a bit further than the Emancipation Proclamation itself. It said now that slaves shall be freed when they enter Union lines. One other thing is going on. You can't read this document, I know, at least not much of it, but it is one of the coolest documents I ever found. And I have no idea why it was in the Rochester University Library. I was doing Frederick Douglass research there, and they said, we got this amazing Lincoln document. Want to see it? Sure. It's an actual copy of the actual document. Long story made short, the date on this is, March 14, 1862. This is Lincoln writing to a senator from Delaware, McDougal, I believe. And Lincoln went to the census of 1860, did this on his own, calculated. Lincoln wants a gradual plan of emancipation. If Lincoln had had his way of shaping history, emancipation would have been gradual and compensated. That is, slave owners would be compensated for their loss of property. Yeah, I know. He's an old Henry Clay Whig. He's still hope, but look at the nightmare he's sitting on. This is an all-out war now, and he's not winning. So he writes to Delaware, the smallest of all slave states still in the Union, and he calculates. That's what these numbers are. See the line here? And I'll finish with this, I promise. I got a torn rotator cuff, so this is hard. He calculates that the war is and this is accurate, the war is costing at this point about $2 million a day. He calculates that the slaves in Delaware, of which there are only 1,798. He creates an average price for slaves of only $400. I think it's a little low there. But he calculates that the slaves in Delaware are worth $719,000. And then he calculates the cost of freeing the slaves in the other border states that have not left the Union. I don't have that up in front of you, but they are, of course, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. Much larger slave population, and he even includes the District of Columbia in this. This is March, this is before DC emancipation. He calculates that in Maryland there are 87,188 slaves. He uses the 1860 census. Lincoln's doing his own research. 225,000 in Kentucky, and 114,000 in Missouri. He calculates all of them, and he says, put them all together, and they're worth approximately $174 million. I'm sorry, $174,000. And he says, look, this is much cheaper than fighting this war. How about we start with you, Delaware, tiny little Delaware. You go first. Gradual emancipation. And then he posits 20-year period. On the next page it says, on January 1st of 1882, all slaves will be freed. This is that side of Lincoln that doesn't fit the great emancipator, does it? But he's desperate. He's trying to get the border states to agree to begin some kind of gradual plan. What happens? They all tell him absolutely no. Delaware first. He tries Kentucky. He didn't even go any further than Kentucky. But the calculation is, this war is costing us in blood and treasure and money far more than what would be to buy the freedom of all these people. And maybe, just maybe, the Confederates would say, that's a lot of money. Maybe we'll take it. I don't know. Now, he's dead wrong about that. That's what Bruce Catton's quote was saying. This was not acceptable to Jefferson Davis or anyone else in the Confederacy to speak of. But this is where Lincoln was in that spring. At the same time, he's going to sign DC Emancipation. He's going to sign the Second Confiscation Act. And 5 days after the Battle of Antietam, what does he do? He issues the Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which he had kept in a drawer in the War Department. He'd been drafting it, we believe, since sometime in June. He had a little secret desk that he locked over at the War Department. He didn't want any of his aides in the White House seeing it, apparently. And he'd go over there and he'd work on it in case it came the time for an executive order. But what did that preliminary proclamation say? He said he was giving the South 100 days. 100 days until January 1st. And on January 1st, if they don't lay down their arms, and he knew they weren't going to lay down their arms, even in the wake of Antietam. It's why he was so angry at McClellan here. And he will, within 3 weeks, go out to Antietam, the first major battlefield Lincoln ever saw, and fire McClellan. But he's trying to get the South to maybe make a deal with him, even though he knows they're really not going to. And it says in the preliminary proclamation, if they don't lay down their arms and agree by January 1st, all the slaves in the states in rebellion are thenceforward and forever free. Now, I'll pick it up there, but I want to say one other quick thing. In that 100 days, bets were off for a lot of people. Was he really going to do this? Would he sign it? Was this a vow or a ploy? And for black Americans, they just weren't exactly sure, namely Douglas and so many others. But what also one finds is that out there in the land, in the thousands and thousands of letters being written by soldiers, in editorials in newspapers, that language you see in the Emancipation Proclamation about doing this for what he calls military necessity, this has often been one of the things Lincoln's accused of, he only did it for military necessity. That wasn't his idea at all. It's being used all over the country, in newspapers, by soldiers themselves. And we had a great book about 8 years ago by Lou Mazer, who went and read soldiers' letters for this purpose. People are using that term, military necessity, emancipation as a means of defeating the Confederacy, defeating the South. And Charlie Brewster believes this in his bones now. You gotta free the slaves to defeat the South. Now, is that just military necessity? Or is that called winning a war? Or both? We like our Lincoln pure. We like our decisions to be moral and not highly political. But all great decisions, we can hope, are both. It did say thenceforward and forever free. And when Lincoln does sign the final proclamation on January 1st of 63, he never looked back. And he knew he had put the war on a whole different course. And they better win now. Okay.